The following is a journeywise network production.
I'm Shane.
I'm Ronnie.
Ronnie and I have been friends for 40 years on this journey, and so we want you to be a part of it. So grab your mason jar and come join us as we grow Journeywise together. Hey friends, I'm Shane Stanford.
And I'm Ronnie Kent.
And we welcome you back to our conversation called Journeywise, as we are talking about the holiday season, but not just all of the festivities and all of the lights, but really talking about the birth of Jesus and what surrounds that amazing story, not just in Scripture, but how we live that out through the power of the Holy Spirit every year. And last episode, we talked about families of origin and why they are so important to who we are and why they were important to Jesus. I mean, there was a lot riding on who Joseph was and their lineage, and who Mary was and her lineage. But today we're going to talk about the actual event. This is not something that I get to talk a lot about, the birth of my children. I've talked about it, having children, but those days were probably the most miraculous days of my life and had more effect on me than just about anything. I've never been as happy or as scared as I was on all three of those days at that same time. So, but Ronnie, what's the first memory that comes to mind about the days your children were born?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, just briefly, and I don't know that people really understood what we were talking about, but uh, my first daughter was born 9 months and 9 days after we got married to a physician and a nurse. And needless to say, we were gone all the way from joked about a lot to actually said, "What's wrong with you people?" Sort of thing. So after we got over, because I was an intern, thought I knew everything. I worked my wife up for hepatitis and all sorts of things when she was nauseated and all that stuff. Anyway,
Did it ever occur to you at that point that she might be pregnant, or was that just?
oh, absolutely not. And finally, I said, "Well, I guess you need to go see a real doctor." And the first thing he asked her is, "Could you be pregnant?" So guess what? She was. But so
I
so
love it. I love it.
but God just knows how to bless you. And we look back, and of course, so many ways. I've had good friends that have been blessed with their last child after about 8 or 10 years of no children, and one came in. I remember, and I was the first one they told, and they said, and so I said, "Well, congratulations." And they said, "Oh," and the girl started crying. Actually, the lady started crying. I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "I thought you would look at me and said, 'What's wrong with you, you fool?'" So, I was in awe, like you were just saying, of the whole process, and continued to be in awe of the whole process. And when Emily was born, my first, I remember, I distinctly remember. Well, the first thing I remember, and I don't want to be too vivid or visual in this, but I remember that when I first saw her face, the first thought I had was, "Oh my goodness, she looks like me." I thought,
How
I mean,
bad
really,
could it be?
would God actually do that to a girl? This, Unfortunately, she grew up looking more and more like her mother. So anyway, but I had this feel, I had this. It was all, I guess I could just say, an immediate connection,
Mm,
an immediate sense. I never met this person before, and there was this immediate sense of oneness.
mm,
And so I didn't recognize it. Well, it happened again with my son 3.5 years later. And I thought, that was that same thing that I had. Well, with the third one with Grace, 3.5 years later, we kind of planned a little better, didn't we? With her, I was watching for it.
mm,
And it was not a physical thing. It was not an emotional thing. It was absolutely a spiritual thing.
mm.
That there was a sense of oneness with that child that immediately, knowing nothing else, I would die for that child.
Wow. Wow.
And that was the most unique part to me.
And I had heard people say that they would die for someone. And I think we've used those phrases at different parts of our life. It was the only time and the first time that I really knew for certain that I would have no problem putting my life
Yeah.
as a substitute for them. And it also raised for me, and we can talk about this later, the depth of what it must have been like for God the Father to send His
Mm,
Son. Uh,
mm.
and there was all those emotions. But as we talk about the birth of our children, we're looking, of course, set against the backdrop of the holiday season and the birth of Jesus. I mean, Mary and Joseph, if you talk about bad luck, they hadn't had a census called in the area in generations, and here they have to go to Bethlehem, which is a good solid 60 miles south of where they were living, and to do that by donkey. I don't know if anyone's ever walked 60 miles, but it takes a little while, and you're pregnant. Um, you
In
know,
labor, in
in labor.
labor, probably.
And there's also the conversation going on about, who these people are and what did they really do, and there's always that conversation going on, I'm sure, behind their backs, and which causes, as we talked about last week, families to have different impressions and interactions, and so there's all that they're dealing with. They get to where they're going, Bethlehem, and there's no room. And we're not talking about that, they're going to have to stay in a much less nice motel. There's no room. Talk about just the physical inhibitions of being in a manger.
Well, I mean, the fact of just the inconvenience of it, not of delivering a first child. Okay,
Yes. Yeah.
subsequent children just kind of do their own thing, but the
That's
first child can be difficult.
yes.
And we're talking, you have to incorporate that total man and total God
Yeah.
that takes this beyond it's never nothing like this has ever happened before. There is no other God like this. I mean, and so so just the inconvenience of it and the being unaware. I don't know how many times Joseph had been around or even Mary had been around birth. This was their first child, and I don't know, what I really don't know much about their own families,
Yeah.
as to their order, but he didn't know what he was doing, and
Well,
the
and
the
it's been pointed out that though Jesus was fully God and fully human, Joseph was fully human.
yeah, yeah,
So
there was yeah.
he was along for the ride. So
And
anyway,
and so I cannot imagine. I cannot imagine even in it's like physicians will tell you all the time though, it's the most awkward people at an accident are physicians
mm,
because we're not prepared to do things without a lot of equipment and all this other stuff.
sure.
Even a physician that would know what he was doing would be very uncomfortable in those circumstances. And
I know
one of the
that.
things we do is we want everything to be so sterile when we're delivering a child because they're so susceptible. I
Yeah.
mean, and this was a stable. This was a stable. I mean, I don't know if we've had animals. Stables are not the cleanest place
They're
in the
not.
world. And
No.
and and taking care of here again, not to get too, with the biology of it, but placentas and umbilical cords and and I know there's just it is fraught with complexity. Let's put it that way.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Fraught with complexity. You can only imagine too the emotions that are running here.
Oh,
I mean, I remember my wife saying things to me during each of the labors that were very direct. Put it that way, very direct. You can only imagine how many bumps along the road she
uh-huh.
was reminding Joseph of. How many times she said, "You know what? We need to find somewhere to stay. We need to take care of that." Or even just and this is in all seriousness, just the fear of the unknown. Just know, hey, gosh, this is our baby, Joseph, and you know, is this is not the way it should be. Can you imagine that?
No, no. I tell you, I think that God was preparing not only them, but I think the whole world in that birthing process for what Jesus was coming for.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
he was coming extraordinary, and this was by far an extraordinary, way above ordinary birth.
Mm.
Not just in its significance, obviously the most significant birth that's ever happened, but also in its complexity, in its ordinariness. Is that a word? Ordinariness, you
Common.
know,
Yeah.
and commonness, and I think that there's so much to learn from the Christmas story that has such great implications for what Jesus was all about.
Well, think about the when Emily was born, your oldest daughter. Um, let's just think about it from the personal side. When you went in there, was it hard for you to separate being the father, expectant father to be, and the doctor?
No, not at all. Because
Talk about that.
well, I mean, when I was a third year medical student, my first rotation was OBGYN, and and my first part was in labor and delivery. My first day was labor and delivery, and about, I would say, 10 minutes into that rotation, I decided this was not my calling
Mm,
because, like you say, I walked past a young girl on a gurney in labor and just kind of spoke to her, nodded to her to acknowledge her presence. She sat up, grabbed me around the neck, pulled me down beside her, and said, "Get this baby out of me." And I said, "Okay, we'll do our best to do."
that's not my rotation.
Not my deal. So I was totally, I was the father, didn't have any desire to participate other than being the father. And sometimes we don't I think we as fathers don't identify our roles appropriately, even
Sure,
starting in the labor and delivery room.
sure.
Uh, we are support staff right there. We're not in control. And so we're there to make the process as good as it possibly can be, and then we move more into, and I think, and this is for a future podcast, but I think fathers sometimes don't transition well from
Mm,
that birthing room on
yeah.
into where their role should be.
Sure. Well, and I remember the first baby that we had, Sarah Grace, was pretty docile, easy. We used to say that if Sarah Grace had been the only child, we would have been those parents who wanted to do workshops for everyone, do it perfectly. But then little Juliana came along, and
Bless
Juliana,
her heart.
bless her sweetheart, she's a labor and delivery nurse now. But she was a fired up little thing, even in the birth canal, and had some distress. And I remember my wife saying, "You need to find someone to pray for us." And I was like, "Hey, that's what I do." And she looked. She looked at me and she said, "I need a pastor, and it's not you." And I thought, I got you. I hear what you're saying. So I did. We found us someone, but and that I do think that's sort of metaphorical for a lot of the things you may be mentioning or referring to this. That there are times in our life when it's important for us to be one thing or the other, and there are so many times that I think we miss being the husband or the father because we're trying to live up to expectations for everything else. The thing
Absolutely.
the thing that I loved about the birth situation was that not it was hard to miss what you were at that point. I mean, the focus was pretty clear. You know what I mean? So
Yes. You were generally told what you should be done should
exactly.
be done at that time. And you and I both have sweet wives, but we also have wives that like for things to happen the way they should happen.
Yeah.
And so I was directed to do that. So
What about the emotions that you felt? I tell people there are emotions that I felt during the birthing of my daughters that I have not felt any other time in life. And they were the first times that I felt them. Was there anything like that for you that you identified in terms of those emotions?
well, I will always go back to that oneness, that sense of I think a spiritual connection, and then there's that physical connection that, I'll be honest with you, even as a pediatrician, that physical connection with my daughter was awkward,
Mm,
and just this is my baby, this,
Yeah.
other people's babies, I could kind this was my baby. And so and then there was that mental connection of, oh my goodness, if something had happened to me before Emily was born, Anne was okay. I mean, she was, but if something happened to me now, and I'm responsible, not only just in a parenting, type deal, developmentally, but financially, emotional. I have a much greater responsibility in this, and so there was this flood of it's really the old heart, soul, mind, and strength. There was this
Yeah.
flood, and then of course, as you progress after birth, as you progress to the physical aspect of, is there something called sleep that I'm missing?
Mm.
So
Well,
uh,
and don't you think that I think that's part of what I try to counsel parents who are having their first child particularly, but any number child, that there are things that should be waking up in them as they go. I think that's why gestation is an important time period. It allows you to
absolutely.
wake up, and it allows you to get certain things right. And the last thing you need to do as a parent to be is to feel like you just happened upon it. I mean that that, and I think, and I'm trying to be serious here because I see a lot of families who act that way, as though they haven't had time to really prepare. And there is something important about preparing for what the change will be. After the first one came along, we had our second one 2.5 years later, and then 7 years after the first one, we had our third one. And I remember when we were building a house, Ronnie, and the way my wife told me that, and we'd had to go through a lot of different things in order to have a baby. But the way she told me that it had taken was up with the contractor. She said, "We need to build the extra bedroom right here." That's how she told me. And I remember this feeling of, oh my gosh, we're going to have a baby, and then having real financial consequences to it right there in front of me in terms of beams and concrete.
Another room.
I mean, but I've told people I wish other families could see that, like, a little mental budget comes down out of heaven to say, okay, this is what this is going to cost you now, but not just the financial part of it, but this is what your responsibilities are. This is what this little one really does need you for, not just to take care of certain, box checking, but the moments that you can't prepare for, that you may not be prepared for, the conversations late at night. I mean, that day for me, having that little one come into the world, it was a recalibration of my own identity. And I think that's what I think Joseph experienced that day with the birth of Jesus. How do you think Joseph felt different, or after that, the birth in the manger? Have you ever thought about, because we don't get a lot of conversation about Joseph after that, but what do you
No, in
think?
fact, I think really when Jesus was 12 is the only other time that, is
Last
that
time.
right?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
he
last
shows
time.
up in the story, and he was not didn't seem like as upset as Mary was about about him staying behind. But you know, I don't know that I really thought, other than the fact that the father, the husband, was the uh, core to the family. I mean, the mother certainly had her role, but he was responsible. I mean, we kind of don't think about, when you were a Jewish father, it was not just a house type thing. It was a societal thing. It was a
Yeah.
political thing. It was a nationality thing. He was responsible for basically every aspect of his children's life. And so I can imagine, and not only that, but just the practical things of the next day.
Yeah.
I mean, and the next week, he had responsibilities in their tradition for things to happen pretty soon. And
Well, I mean, within 8 days, there were certain
yeah,
things that had to take place, and then so many months and so many years after that. And he was the guy that had to make that happen in just terms of practicality.
exactly. So I do think you're right. I think he had and I mean, you can call the I think he would prefer the word responsibility, not burden, but I think he did have a responsibility, and think is, as best we know, he did all those things. I mean, because of the stories that we have of, their experience in the temple.
Are there any particular prayers or scriptures that God has laid on your heart about being a father, from that day that your children
Oh,
were born?
Yes. There's
Several hundred, but is there any
there's
that
well, I tend to pray scripture for my family. Phew. Now see, you messing me up.
it wasn't an
But
accident?
so, I think that just in fact, it's talked about in the story of Jesus' birth. But one of the things I prayed for my children was what happened to Jesus, and that is that he increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. And I think God answered that prayer now, 35 to 40 something years later. I've seen my children, and now I'm praying that same prayer for my grandchildren. I think God's faithful.
Yeah.
And I think that we, for our children to increase in wisdom and in stature, that's that part, and then in favor with man, not just God, but with man.
Mhm.
We've seen this, Shane, in our life. God's got us here for a purpose. For people to see our good works. He wants us to see good works, but to give Him glory for it.
Mm,
And so, yes, that's one in particular
that's
uh,
good.
that that I've always used.
So as we finish up on this conversation, what is the thing that you would like for people to understand how they're different because of the day this little one comes into their life? Whether this was a joyful experience or not, there's certain things that we know of, and I've got an example, but I'd love to hear yours first. What is it, that one thing that you would want them to know?
No matter how you got here, if it's 9 months and 9 days unplanned, or if it's very methodically planned and orchestrated, no matter how you got here, God is about to bless you with I don't know if you remember, I was doing a talk on why we have children, and you gave, I thought, a very appropriate and very thoughtful answer, and that is that children are our extension into the future.
Mm,
That's us. It's us living into the future. And so, at the birth of our children, and I think it's especially true with Jesus, that he came to complete. He said, "I came to show you the Father," and he came to complete the work God had started, at creation, because John 1 is really the creation story again, but given with Jesus instead of with God, who is God. But I think no matter how you get to the creation part of that child, that God is starting something beautiful that He can use, no matter family of origin, no matter how you got to that child. But celebrate that birth, just like we celebrate the birth of Jesus, and live expectantly of what God is going to use you to do for that child and for the world because of Him, not
mm.
because of you.
Well, I think that's beautiful because and then similarly, I think that the birth of Jesus to a human mother, and the birth of Jesus to this man who, although is a stepfather, an adopted father, you still feel the presence of Joseph and his care and concern. I think this experience is so important for us because it reminds me that God knows from the very beginning, um, what we go through. He knows, and he has experienced the same emotions that we will experience. There's nothing that surprises God. There's nothing that
No,
catches God off guard. And even in the deepest of our relationships, He's intimately connected to where we are, where we've been, and where we're going. And I think there's a beauty to that, that God has loved us so much through Jesus. And that's why I think Christmas, beyond the lights and the trees and the decorations, as beautiful as all that is, the most beautiful thing is the fact that in that most unlikely of places, a manger in Bethlehem, God said, "This is how much I love you. I want to experience it from the beginning." And just what an amazing thing that is. It changed
absolutely.
me, you know. Yeah.
Changed us all.
Yeah.
Changed us all. Yeah.
All right. Well, I'd say to those who are listening, if you'd like to send us a question, or if you need a prayer request, we encourage you to go to journeywise.network. Go to our prayer wall. You'll be able to offer your prayer request, and we have folks who are praying for you, and others can pray for you. If you have a question, send that to Ann L. at morewestcenter.org. That's ANL at morewestcenter.org. And of course, if you've listened to this, go and give us a 5-star review and give us a rating. We would love that, so others can hear this conversation. All right, Ronnie, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Thanks for listening to JourneyWise, a JourneyWise Network production.